Hello and welcome to this video where I look at Act 1, Scene 1 of Romeo and Juliet. Up to this point you should have watched 4 videos that I've done on Romeo and Juliet. This is number 5. Well, after a prologue which promised us romance, action, violence and murder, the audience would be absolutely primed, ready to see some of that, and Act 1, Scene 1 does not disappoint. To begin with, it is set in Verona, and I talked in the previous video about the setting of Verona. It's obviously authentic in terms of the fact that the story was originally an Italian story, but also it is a city reputed to be a very romantic city, and as a very hot place with very narrow streets, so tempers would flare there. And we see then that this scene takes place in a public place, and that would surely make the audience think about how the prologue talked about civil unrest, and they might make that connection that, oh, this is going to be the first bit of civil unrest. Now we have Samson and Gregory come in armed with swords and bucklers. Well, first off, let's have a think about the name. Samson is obviously one of the characters from the Bible. The story of Samson is basically that Samson was granted supernatural strength by God, and I think the sort of average person would associate the name Samson with strength. The name Gregory is a Greek name. Originally, the original Greek means watchful and vigilant. So if you put the two together, we get the idea that these two Capulets are strong, aggressive, violent guys out on the watch looking for opportunities to flex their muscles. And that's backed up with the fact that they are armed with swords and bucklers. A sword, obviously, is a weapon. It's different to a knife in that a knife has other functions. A sword is an out-and-out weapon for battle. A buckler is some armour on the arm. So these guys are clearly out and about, cruising, looking for a fight. And we can immediately assume that we're going to get some trouble, because the fact that they come armed with swords, in a modern film, it's like the Western of its day when people walk into the street with their guns around their waist. Something is going to kick off. And then we have this first exchange between Samson and Gregory. Samson says, "Gregory, on my word, will not carry coals." Gregory says, "No, for then we should be colliers." Samson says, "I mean, and we being collar will draw." Gregory says, "Aye, while you live, draw your neck out of the collar." Well, as with all of Shakespeare, some confusion here. So let me first just translate it into a modern translation. Basically, Samson's saying, Gregory, we will not put up with insults. The phrase "will not carry coals," meaning we won't put up with insults, comes from the root there being that famous saying to heap burning coals on someone's head. So we'll not put up with insults. And then Gregory says, "No, for then we should be colliers," and a collier is a coal miner. Now, a coal miner at this time was a very disrespected job. So there's a bit of wordplay going on here, which I'll get into in a second. Samson then says, "I mean, and we being collar will draw." Collar means anger, so a different meaning here. If I am made angry, I will draw my sword. And Gregory says, "Aye, while you live, draw your neck out of the collar." It's talking in the collar there about the hangman's noose. So he's saying, while you live, you should try to avoid problems and difficulties. Now, this is a very complex exchange between Samson and Gregory, and it is in stark contrast to the prologue, which was so clear and very well explained. There was no confusion over what was meant, and yet now we have this really witty exchange between these two friends. And this is an example of Shakespeare's wordplay and use of puns. Puns are basically where words have more than one meaning and you make a sort of joke based on the different meanings. And here we have three words which are punned on. Collier, meaning a coal miner, collar, meaning anger, and collar, meaning a hangman's noose. So what Shakespeare does here is he uses all three words, and the result is that there's a very witty exchange between the two friends. A bit of banter, they're winding each other up to, sort of taking the mickey out of each other. And Shakespeare really is showing his skill with the language in his ability to do that. Then Samson moves on. I strike quickly, being moved. Gregory says, but thou art not quickly moved to strike. And Samson says, a dog of the house of Montague moves me. Well, I strike quickly, being moved simply means I attack quickly when I'm angry. But thou art not quickly moved to strike is Gregory again punning and playing on the words that Samson's used and saying, you might attack quickly when you're angry, but you don't quickly get angry. And then Samson says, a dog of the house of Montague moves me. Those horrible Montagues do make me angry. And here we see the word dog, and this is an insult which still gets used today quite a bit. Derogatory term, it's a negative word. Obviously, calling someone essentially, a wild animal of lesser intelligence than a human. But it's quite interesting to see that this insult has carried on to today, because a lot of Shakespeare's insults, as we'll see later in the scene, don't make sense today unless someone explains them to you, whereas we understand that to be called a dog is an insult. And then Gregory says, to move is to stir, and to be valiant is to stand. Therefore, if thou art moved, thou runnest away. Now, this is a very complex piece. Let me explain it. What he's saying is, if you are moved to action, then by the process of moving, you're basically backing off and running away. So actually, to be brave, you just need to stand still. So there's all this wordplay and this clever banter that, you've got to think must have gone over the heads of a lot of the audience. Samson says, a dog of that house shall move me to stand. I will take the wall of any man or maid of Montagues. Well, what does he mean? When he means referring again to the Montagues as dogs, he's saying any of those horrible Montagues would provoke me to action. And I take the wall with male and female Montagues. Now this is a little historical thing. So Elizabethan streets were very different to today. One of the main things was that in the Elizabethan era, waste. So you'd go to the toilet, and the results would not be flushed down the down the pipes, down the sewers, and gone. They would just be thrown out into the streets. So the streets would be absolutely filthy and full of muck and waste. And because of that, if there were horses and carts and things going through, it would splash on people as they went past. So there's this saying to take the wall, which means that if two people are walking down the street like this, the polite thing to do is to let someone take the wall, to let them to walk on the inside so they wouldn't be splashed by the filth from the gutter. Now, in this play, what is being said here is, I would take the wall, I would take the place of privilege against the Montagues who I hate so much, and therefore make the Montagues take this position that they're going to get splashed and everything by all the waste. Gregory comes back by saying that shows thee a weak slave, for the weakest goes to the wall. In other words, that's a weak thing to do because we let women have that position, and therefore, you're calling yourself a woman. So it's again all of this back and forth banter between the two friends, all light-hearted. There's no enmity in it. It's just kind of wordplay and banter and jokes and sarcasm. And Samson says, true, and therefore women, being the weaker vessels, are ever thrust to the wall. Therefore I will push Montague's men from the wall and thrust his maids to the wall. So what Samson's saying is, you're right, women, being weaker than men, are always being pushed up against the wall. And this is the beginnings now of some sexual innuendo, because he's not suggesting we let women go closer to the wall so they are in the place of privilege away from danger. He's saying we thrust them up against the wall to have sex with them. And what he's saying is he would take the Montague men and beat them up and chuck them away from the place of safety, and then shove the Montague women up against the wall and have sex with them. So it's this really over-the-top bravado from Samson here. And then we have Gregory, who just, this bit cracks me up. He is almost like he now becomes the voice of reason and says, whoa, hang on a minute, the quarrel's between our masters and us, their men. In other words, he's saying, leave the women out of this. It's about us and our masters. And I just find that a bit funny. It's like, he said, Samson said something Gregory didn't particularly like. And then Samson says, "'Tis all one. I will show myself a tyrant when I have fought with the men. I will be cruel with the maids and cut off their heads." So he's saying, it's all the same. They're all the enemy family, and I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to be such a nasty guy that I will fight the men and then cut the heads off the maids. Now Gregory realises this for the bit of wordplay that it is, and says, "The heads of the maids?" And Samson says, aye, the heads of the maids, or their maiden heads. Take it in what sense thou wilt. So this is a pun now on the idea of maidenhead, aka virginity. So he's not saying he's going to literally cut their heads off. He's saying he's going to take their virginity. So it's a very bawdy, laddish sense of humour that's emerging here in this scene. Of course, the audience would be loving this, whether they understood and got the references or not. They would be loving this idea that we've just had a prologue that tells us there's going to be a fight and romance and death and battle, and then along come these two, gangsters dressed up with weapons, being really aggressive and confrontational and sarcastic, and saying how much they hate the Montagues. The audience would be chomping at the bit, knowing that it's going to kick off. Well, hopefully you found this video useful. Obviously haven't finished Act 1 Scene 1 yet, but I'm going to stop this video now so that the videos are in manageable chunks. So do follow on by watching the next video in the series.